Our speakers today are Beth Stroshane from Embodied Building Information and Mark Chen from Skanska. We're going to have time probably a little bit in between sort of switching speakers and at the end for having questions. And so if people have questions, they can go ahead and sort of type those into the chat. And with that, I'll kick it over to Beth.
Hello, everybody, and thanks for coming to this meeting virtually to talk about carbon leadership and specifications. So of the many specification presentations, today I've decided, because of the audience, I can just skip the part about why do we care. So we assume everybody cares about embodied carbon for being here. So the next thing that is really challenging about embodied carbon and specifications is really this: avoiding the blue screen, right? That's where you're trying to keep track of, okay, so if I've got embodied carbon, that's this really complicated thing. And then I'm going to talk about all of the materials within a building. And then I'm going to talk about specifications. And then that's about the time your brain sets up and you're like, okay, I can't even function. I'm going to go detail flooring transitions or something else, anything but this. So how do we avoid blue screen is the first thing. So the way you do that is you focus your efforts on the larger impacts. Don't worry about sealant. Don't worry about transitions. Look and focus your effort where it makes the biggest difference. So here's an example of information that you can get out of EC3 or other programs that tell you kind of where your big areas are. And Mark provided these out of EC3, I believe. So if you've got a shell and core project, where are your big impact areas? So ceilings down here, this teeny tiny bit, there's not much in ceilings. So if you're running out of time, skip ceilings. Really, if you're in a shell and core project, your steel, your aluminum, and your ready mix concrete, that's where your big areas are. So if you have the ability to focus on 3 things, focus on those areas. But thinking, oh, well, all this stuff down here, this little tiny stuff, that doesn't matter. Well, if you move into a TI project, this is where your gyp, your cold form metal framing, your ceilings start to make a difference. Your finishes start to become the biggest piece of the project. So this is how you can figure out, okay, if I can only take on 3 things, which things do I take on? The next thing is to look at specifications and the components of specifications, because these can often be this big complicated thing that no one wants to deal with. Really, specifications have 3 big pieces related to embodied carbon. One is performance criteria. So just like any other performance criteria, like the thickness of your resilient flooring or the strength of your concrete, just one more performance criteria. 2, the products that you've selected to comply with those performance criteria. Like you can't have a acoustical ceiling panel that's 2 inches thick, because what works in your design is 1 inch thick. So thinking about embodied carbon as just one more performance criteria that you are selecting product to comply with. And 3, the documents required to prove that the products meet the performance criteria. It's not good enough to just say, oh, I want the best or lowest embodied carbon acoustical ceiling panel. We need to know what performance criteria you're going to use to prove that it meets those requirements. So those are the pieces that specifications really are. So if you break it down into 3 sections and you think about just these 3 things, then it gets to the point that it's something you can keep your head wrapped around as you work through the process. Okay, along the lines of just another performance criteria, this is showing how my acoustical ceiling panel specification changed when I introduced embodied carbon. So the general language that changed in my specifications because I was talking about embodied carbon, meaning this is language that I put in every spec section that I talked about embodied carbon. So I needed to alter my submittals, which I was asking for EPDs for lead already. So I had to add and demonstrates product complies with the required global warming potential baseline. That's the language I had to add to my submittals when I added an embodied carbon baseline. Because the EPDs requested by lead already had all of the correct third-party verified and the ISOs that it needed to comply with. So the other things, because I want to ask about embodied carbon in the exact same way in every one of the sections to reduce confusion, I laid it out like I have here so that I could keep it consistent. So for the performance criteria, so the product specific language that I had to change, so this is changes for each spec section. So that's where we've got acoustical panel global warming potential baseline, because that baseline is different. The performance criteria, that is that actual baseline. Which system boundary we're talking about, what the declared unit is. Are we talking about a square foot or a square meter? Because that makes a big difference if you're comparing things. And which product category rule are we talking about? And product category rules are one of the little known things, or often not known things, about environmental product declarations. And it's important to have consistent product category rules or your scores are not comparable. So just like you wouldn't be able to compare two things if one was in square feet and one was in square meters, one would appear less, even though it's not. The same is with product category rules. So if we don't have consistent product category rules, you can compare the scores from American football and European football and not be comparing anything that's actually comparable. So that's why that's important. And then moving down, once we've selected a product, these are the things that we want to make sure we include so that we can show that we've complied with the baseline that we've set. So global warming potential, and this is where in EC3 right now, it depends on whether you're talking about the EC3 global warming adjusted value, which is slightly different than the value that's printed on the EPD. So if you're unsure which one your project is using, you can include them both, or if you know, you can include one or the other. And also if you've selected which plant you want the product to come out of and that this data is based on, you'll want to include that too. So here's the other really important thing about embodied carbon and sustainability requirements of product. So unicorns are things that you cannot prove exist, even if you believe in them a whole bunch. And the challenge with specifying things that you can't prove exist is that depending on the delivery method, the contractor may or may not actually have to provide it to you. If embodied carbon is really important to you, which anyone who's at this meeting it is, you want to make sure that you're not specifying unicorns. So if the contractor comes back and says, well, I can't find a product that meets the baseline that you've shown, they're like, if you left this part out, even if you knew that it was true, and the contractor came back and provided an RFI that said, I was unable to find an acoustical ceiling panel within this baseline, if you've got this data already here that shows that it complies, then you've reduced the number of times that someone can say, well, I just couldn't find it. So if you can prove that what you're asking for exists, then it's really defendable that you're asking the contractor to provide it to the owner. If you just include, I want it to be 50% less than some baseline, you increase your risk that it won't actually show up on the job. So, and how projects deal with unicorns that may or may not exist depends on your delivery method. And how this process works depends greatly on your delivery method. So as an example, if it's design, bid, build, it's a school. And you specify a product and an embodied carbon level that you can't prove exists, the contractor can say this isn't available, and to provide something else that is available may cost the owner more money. So that's going to be in your most adversarial delivery method. So if you are doing design, bid, build, you want to have as much information as you can to prove that the materials you selected and the embodied carbon levels that you can get to is really dialed in. If you're working on an integrated project delivery project where everybody is in the effort together and you're developing things, you can describe unicorns and the team can work together to find them, or to find the best horse that looks like a unicorn. You've just got a lot more flexibility. So if you're talking with other people who are working on embodied carbon projects, be aware of which delivery method each of you are talking about so that you're talking about the same thing, because that changes dramatically. So what we want to do next is talk more about how those things can change as we move along. So the next thing is, do the material choices I make really matter, right? If it's this hard and I have to look up more performance criteria and keep track of these tiny details, does it make a difference? So here's an example of a project that I was working on. And it was a large office project, and it had 150,000 square feet of acoustical ceiling panels. So just thinking about which acoustical ceiling panels that many people think, oh, well, just provide the ones that are about like, that are 2x4, they're an inch thick, and they don't look like 1985, so they're pretty smooth. Okay, you can provide them by Armstrong, USG, or Certainty. We don't care. So by specifying in these 150,000 square feet of acoustical ceiling panel, if USG Mars High NRC or Mars Logix is selected, it is a 69% reduction from our baseline. And sometimes it's really hard to, wrap your head around what that means. It's even hard to wrap your head around 286 metric tons of kilogram or metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Okay, what does that mean? And a thing that was really helpful is that the EPA.gov has this converter. So when I plug that number in, that's 61.8 passenger vehicles driven for 1 year. It is the energy used for 33 homes a year. So once you start thinking about, okay, how much impact this is just acoustical ceiling panels. Okay, from baseline, it's this much reduction. Well, if we use Armstrong instead, okay, it's one of those either or, I don't really care. Then you only can drive 57.7 passenger cars for a year. So just this change in material on the same building makes a difference. If the project uses Ultima, which is often everybody's favorite because they had an awesome rep, you only get 49.9. So just switching the order of what your basis of design is for your acoustical ceiling panels, you can run, 4 more houses energy for a year just by making that choice. So it does matter. And you don't have to take big liability leaps and use materials you've never used before. Just look up the materials that you use now. What gyp do you use? What acoustical ceiling panels do you use? What hollow metal doors do you use? And look at which one is lower embodied carbon. And even if you just change the order, if you just say, I'm going to use USG as my acoustical ceiling panel basis of design, and say they can provide comparables by Armstrong instead of the other way around, you could make a difference. And that's not a change in liability at all. Or maybe you look at, these are the 5 acoustical or the 5 hollow metal door set manufacturers we use all the time. And this is, we're going to list them in this order and we're going to drop off the bottom 2. I mean, so those are the kinds of changes that you can make that don't actually change the product that you select for your job at all. Okay, next we're going to hand it off to Mark, who is going to talk about the construction side. So is there one question as we hand it off to Mark?
Yeah, so there's a question from Jay about, is it too soon to put an embodied carbon delta value for subs to fill out on our substitution request forms?
My challenge would be is, can you do that math? So if you can tell them how to do the math to show that, I'd say that you could put it on there. But if it takes you an hour to figure out how to do that math, I think that that is problematic. But you can say that it has to be equivalent or meet the same baseline. So a checkbox that says, does it meet this baseline, is totally legal if you've got the baseline, because all they have to do that is open up EC3 and look at an EPD. But the delta is going to be math that is a challenge.
And Beth and Jay, I'll try and touch on that too in my presentation. I think there's a good